The house at the corner of Elm Street and Hawthorne Lane in Westport, Connecticut, was a perfect example of suburban luxury, large, white, and adorned with flower boxes that burst with seasonal color. But the most meticulous part of the house wasn't its lush, well-maintained garden or its tasteful exterior. It was Margaret Ward, the woman inside, who had arranged every aspect of her life, her home, and her son's life with almost surgical precision. Margaret had lived in the house for nearly 4 decades, and every corner of it reflected her need for control and order. Her life had been calm, steady, and well-planned, just as she liked it, until recently. Margaret sat in the parlor sipping her evening tea, her thoughts heavy with worry. Thomas, her only son, had always been the centerpiece of her life. He had been born in Bridgeport 35 years ago, the child she'd always wanted, a perfect little boy with wide eyes and a sweet smile. Margaret had raised him with firm but loving hands, guiding his every step, ensuring he became the man she had always envisioned. After all, Thomas was hers. He was her legacy, her purpose. Margaret's late husband, Richard, had been a successful investment banker. He had provided for them well, but he had been emotionally distant, leaving the parenting and household matters entirely to Margaret. When Richard passed suddenly 5 years ago, Margaret had been left to manage things on her own, and though she missed him in a perfunctory way, she relished the total control that came with his absence. But in recent months, Margaret's control over her world had begun to slip. It all started in April 2020, when Thomas casually mentioned over one of their weekly dinners that he had met someone. Emily Cross, he had said, his voice taking on a softness that Margaret had never heard before. The name felt like a slap, and Margaret's hand trembled ever so slightly as she sipped her wine. A woman was encroaching on the careful, perfect life Margaret had built. From that moment, Margaret knew she would have to act. She would have to protect Thomas from making a mistake that could tear him away from her. Margaret had always been observant. Over the years, she had noticed every small change in Thomas. The shift in his tone when he was stressed about work, the way his shoulders sagged when he was tired. It was a skill she had honed since his childhood, watching him with laser focus, guiding him as a mother should. Now she saw something different, something troubling. In the weeks following that dinner, Margaret noticed that Thomas had begun to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. He visited her less often. His once frequent phone calls had dwindled to a handful each week, and when they did speak, he seemed distracted. When she asked about work, he would give short answers, changing the subject to talk about Emily. Every time he spoke about her, Margaret felt a knot tighten in her chest. Who was this woman who had stolen Thomas's attention? The first time Margaret met Emily was in early May 2020. Thomas had brought her over for a casual brunch at the house, a house where Margaret had deliberately not invited Emily, but Thomas had insisted. Margaret had greeted Emily with a tight, controlled smile, her eyes scanning the younger woman up and down. Emily was beautiful, that much was clear. She was younger than Thomas by almost a decade, with long, honey-blonde hair that she wore in loose waves, and a smile that seemed too confident, too warm. Margaret hated her on sight. Throughout brunch, Margaret watched Emily closely. The way she spoke, the way she touched Thomas's arm when she laughed, it all made Margaret's skin crawl. There was a familiarity between them, a closeness that Margaret couldn't tolerate. Thomas had never allowed another woman to get this close to him. He had dated, of course, short, meaningless flings with women who never lasted. But Emily was different. The way Thomas looked at her made Margaret feel sick. He was slipping away, and it terrified her. It was a humid afternoon on May 12, 2020, when Margaret discovered the first real evidence of Emily's intrusion into Thomas's life. She had stopped by Thomas's apartment, an apartment Margaret had helped him choose, an apartment only a few blocks from her home in Westport, under the pretense of bringing him some of his favorite homemade cookies. But when she entered his bedroom to leave the neatly wrapped box on his nightstand, she saw something that made her stomach drop. A delicate gold necklace was draped over the corner of his dresser. It was simple, a thin chain with a small heart-shaped pendant. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, her fingers hovering above it, but never touching it. This was Emily's. It had to be. The thought of that woman leaving her things in Thomas's apartment, claiming space in his life, sent a wave of nausea through Margaret. She gripped the edge of the dresser, her breath coming in short gasps. How dare she? That evening, Margaret called Thomas, her voice carefully measured. She wanted to ask him about the necklace, about Emily's increasing presence in his life, but instead, she chose a more subtle approach. "You haven't been around much lately," she said, her tone light but laced with accusation. "You're always so busy these days. I hardly see you anymore." Thomas, who sounded preoccupied on the other end, sighed. "Yeah, work's been a lot lately, Mom, and Emily and we've just been spending a lot of time together." There it was again. Emily and The words burned in Margaret's ears. It was always about Emily now. "Are you serious about her?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but probing. "I just worry, you know. It seems like things are moving so fast." Thomas hesitated, but when he spoke, his voice was firm. "Yeah, I am serious about her. She's important to me, Mom." Margaret's heart sank. The finality in his tone was unmistakable. He was serious about her. She had feared as much, but hearing it confirmed made her blood run cold. This woman is going to take him from me. As summer crept in, Margaret's desperation intensified. The thought of Emily slowly taking over Thomas's life, of her insidious influence growing with every passing day, kept Margaret awake at night. She began plotting ways to pull him back, to remind him where his true loyalty should lie. She had to make him see reason before it was too late. Margaret's first tactic was subtle. She began calling Thomas more frequently, using any excuse she could think of. "Thomas, dear, could you come over and help me with something? The faucet's leaking and I can't seem to fix it." Or, "I've been feeling a bit under the weather lately. It would be so nice to have you around." Thomas, ever the dutiful son, would come. But Margaret could see the strain in his face, the way his mind seemed to drift elsewhere. His phone would buzz with text messages from Emily, and he would make excuses to leave earlier than he used to. It was as though Margaret could feel him slipping away with each visit, and no matter what she did, she couldn't hold on to him. By June 2020, Margaret's patience was wearing thin. The dinners she had always relied on to maintain their bond had become shorter, less frequent. Thomas had started bringing Emily to the house more often, despite Margaret's disapproval, and each time the tension in the air grew thicker. Margaret would sit across from Emily at the dinner table, her fork clenched tightly in her hand, every word out of Emily's mouth grating on her nerves. She would watch as Thomas and Emily exchanged glances, quiet smiles passing between them as if they shared some private joke. It was unbearable. "I just want to make sure you're making the right choices, Thomas," Margaret would say, her voice dripping with concern. "You know how important it is to find someone who's really right for you." Thomas would always nod politely, but Margaret could see the frustration building behind his eyes. He was growing tired of her constant interference, and she knew it. One evening, after another tense dinner in late July 2020, Margaret could no longer contain her anger. As she stood by the window watching Emily and Thomas leave together, she clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. She's ruining everything. That night, as she lay awake in bed, Margaret made a decision. If Emily wouldn't leave on her own, Margaret would have to make sure she left, by any means necessary. It was a sweltering day in early August 2020 when Margaret made her move. She had heard from Thomas that Emily often jogged in Sherwood Island State Park, a popular spot along the water where locals came to enjoy the fresh air and scenic views. Margaret had no interest in the park itself, but she knew it would be the perfect place to confront Emily, away from prying eyes. Margaret arrived at the park early in the morning, her heart pounding in her chest as she parked her car near the entrance. She had never done anything like this before, stalking someone, waiting for the right moment to strike. But desperation had driven her to this point. She had to protect Thomas. She sat in her car, watching as joggers passed by, her hands gripping the steering wheel. And then she saw her. Emily, with her blonde ponytail bouncing behind her, jogged down the path, her face flushed from the heat. Margaret's blood boiled. She stepped out of the car, her movements stiff and deliberate, and made her way toward Emily. "Emily!" Margaret called out, her voice sharp. Emily slowed to a stop, turning to face Margaret with a look of surprise. "Mrs. Ward? What are you doing here?" Margaret forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice cold. "It's about Thomas." Emily raised an eyebrow, wiping sweat from her brow. "Is something wrong?" Margaret took a step closer, her smile fading. "Yes, something is very wrong. You're ruining him." Emily frowned, clearly taken aback. "I'm sorry, what?" "You've been manipulating him," Margaret continued, her voice growing more heated. "Thomas isn't himself anymore, and it's because of you. You're destroying him." Emily's eyes narrowed, her posture straightening. "Thomas is fine, Mrs. Ward. He's happy. I don't know what you're trying to accuse me of, but—" "You need to leave," Margaret interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. "Thomas belongs with me, not with someone like you." Emily crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "With all due respect, Thomas is an adult. He makes his own choices, and he chose to be with me. You can't control him forever." Margaret's face twisted with fury. "He's mine," she spat, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll make sure you never take him from me." Emily stared at her, clearly unsettled by the venom in Margaret's voice. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Thomas and I are in this together, whether you like it or not." Without waiting for a response, Emily turned and jogged away, leaving Margaret standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. Margaret watched her go, her hands shaking with rage. The confrontation hadn't worked. Emily hadn't backed down. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever to stay in Thomas's life. Margaret's mind raced as she walked back to her car. She had hoped the confrontation would scare Emily off, but now she knew it would take more than words to get rid of her. "If Emily won't leave willingly, I'll have to make sure she's gone for good." The weeks following the confrontation were unbearable for Margaret. Thomas continued to drift further away, spending more and more time with Emily. Margaret's phone calls went unanswered, her invitations to dinner politely declined. Thomas had even started talking about moving in with Emily, a prospect that filled Margaret with dread. She could feel her control over him slipping through her fingers, and the more she tried to hold on, the more he pulled away. It was on the night of September 20th, 2020, that Margaret finally broke. She had called Thomas earlier that day, asking him to come over for dinner. She had spent hours preparing his favorite meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. She had set the table perfectly, just as she always had, each fork and knife in its place, the wine chilled and ready. But when she called to ask what time he would arrive, Thomas's response had been curt. "I can't make it tonight, Mom," he said, his voice distant. "Emily and I are going out." Those words, "Emily and I," echoed in Margaret's mind as she sat alone at the dinner table, staring at the empty chair where Thomas should have been. It was always Emily now. Emily had taken him from her, and no matter what Margaret did, she couldn't pull him back. As she sat in the dimly lit dining room, her hands clenched in her lap, Margaret realized that she couldn't wait any longer. If Emily wasn't going to leave, Margaret would have to make sure she did, permanently. It was a cold evening on December 23rd, 2020, when Margaret made her final move. She knew Thomas was out of town for a business trip in Boston, so she also knew that Emily would be home alone in her apartment in Stamford. Margaret had been planning this moment for weeks, carefully considering every detail. She would confront Emily one last time, and if she refused to leave Thomas, Margaret would end it herself. The apartment complex was quiet when Margaret arrived, the air biting at her skin as she stood outside the door. She rang the doorbell, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily opened the door, her expression confused, but not alarmed. "Mrs. Ward, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Margaret said, her voice calm but cold. "It's about Thomas." Emily hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was warm and cozy, the soft glow of Christmas lights twinkling in the corner. Margaret barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on Emily, her pulse racing with anticipation. "I've been thinking," Margaret began, her voice steady, "about you and Thomas." Emily crossed her arms, clearly on guard. "What about us?" "You need to leave him," Margaret said, her tone deadly serious. "You're destroying him. You're ruining his life, and I won't let you do it." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mrs. Ward, that's not—" Before she could finish, Margaret lunged forward, grabbing a heavy glass vase from the table. Without thinking, she swung it at Emily's head. The vase shattered on impact, and Emily crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath her. Margaret stood frozen, staring down at Emily's lifeless body, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of Christmas music playing in the background. "It's done. She's gone." At 9:30 p.m., Thomas arrived at Emily's apartment, eager to see her after his trip. But as he opened the door, the warm, familiar scent of her perfume was replaced by the metallic tang of blood. His heart sank as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. "Emily!" he called out, his voice trembling. When he saw her, lying in a pool of blood on the floor, his entire world collapsed. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he reached for her, desperately trying to wake her. "Emily, no." But she didn't respond. She was gone. His hands fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please send help. There's been an accident." As he waited for the sirens to approach, Thomas looked up and saw her, his mother standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "I had to do it," Margaret whispered, stepping forward. "She was taking you away from me, Thomas. I couldn't let her." Thomas stared at her, his mind unable to process what he was hearing. What have you done?" Margaret's lips trembled as she reached out to him. "I did it for us," she said softly. "For you. Don't you see?" But all Thomas could see was the woman he had loved, lying dead on the floor, and the mother who had destroyed everything. On December 24th, 2020, Margaret Ward was arrested for the murder of Emily Cross. The small, affluent community of Westport was rocked by the news. Margaret, once seen as a refined, elegant woman, had been exposed as something far darker, a woman consumed by obsession and jealousy. Her trial, which took place in March 2021, revealed the full extent of her control over Thomas. The defense argued that Margaret had suffered from diminished capacity, citing her years of emotional instability and unresolved grief over her husband's death. But the jury was unmoved. Margaret was sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder. For Thomas, the aftermath was a nightmare from which he could never wake. He had lost the woman he loved, and his mother, whom he had trusted more than anyone, had become a stranger, someone capable of unthinkable acts. A year later, on December 23, 2021, Thomas stood alone on the shore of Cape Cod, a place he and Emily had once dreamed of visiting together. The cold wind whipped through the air as he stared out at the horizon, the waves crashing relentlessly against the rocks. The memory of that night, of his mother's betrayal, would never leave him. As he walked away from the shore, Thomas knew that nothing would ever be the same. His mother's obsession had destroyed everything, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives. And though Margaret was locked away, her influence lingered, a scar that would never fully heal. The world had moved on, but for Thomas, the nightmare would never truly end.